Hello and welcome back to the Soap Dragon for another soap making video. Now I'm going to quickly run through the soap making here. I'm not going to show you all of the process because I'm making a 5-layer soap using my milk soap recipe. Now along the back there you can see I've got little plastic cups with the colourants already mixed up. I'm using all natural oxides this time, and I'm actually mixing each layer, the oils and the lye, individually. Now that's a good way of doing it to stop things thickening up on you, but the problem with this being is that jar of lye and milk is getting warm as it's sitting there. So by the time I'm on to layers 3, 4 and 5, it's getting quite lumpy and quite kind of cheesy, which makes it harder to measure, which is not great if I need to make sure I've got enough lye to counteract the oils. So I'm using different methods for other layered soaps in the future, but this is probably the last time I'll be using this one. You can see there's lumps of milk already at the beginning here, so it's not great. So I usually use for a milk soap the frozen milk and add the lye to that, and it's frozen because I don't want the milk to cook, but the lye is still reacting at this point. All the ice is melted, but the reaction is still somewhat going on and the milk is still cooking. So the whole point of this recipe is to try and keep the milk cold for as long as possible. So yeah, I've adapted this one. I still like the milk recipe and I've moved away from using dairy. There's only, I think, 1 or 2 more soaps this year that are using a full dairy milk mix. And then I've got a whole set that use buttermilk, but most of the soaps for the rest of the year are non-milk soaps. They're kind of soy and whatever else. So this soap is just Daffs soap, just Daffodils, and the fragrance I'm using is called Golden Daffodil, which has an unfortunate scent to it. At least in the bottle, and when it's fresh in the soap, it smells like cats. It smells like incontinent cats. It's got a really ammonia kind of rubberish scent to it, but that goes away when it's saponified, but it's really quite strong and pungent and quite unpleasant. So I had a moment of doubt when I started using these, but that's fine. So I'm doing 2 loads at once, and I've worked out that in rough terms, about 180-ish grams of batter makes just over 1 centimetre of a layer, essentially, in that mould. So I'm not going to show you each layer individually because there's 5 layers and it's all the same thing. So each one I get just under 200 grams worth of soap in, and then I start remeasuring. And in between this, I'm cleaning things down, which again is not great because it's time for that milk that's sitting in the background there to continue to react and to continue to get chunky. It doesn't actually affect the finished soap. It's fine. The finished soap is perfect, but that was just an issue that I was aware of, that some of the top layers wouldn't have been perfectly measured. Now between each layer, I'm just using a large fork to create a little bit of texture. I want it to look somewhat like kind of grass coming up through the layers. I didn't fork it deep enough, I don't think. So they just end up with a wobbly layer rather than a straight one. Didn't quite work. But as I'm going through, I'm not being too obsessive about the cleaning necessarily, because I'm going up from a red through orange to yellow, through a slightly greener yellow to green. So the colours are moving up in the spectrum. So I'm not too worried about cleaning in between. I just want to get the majority of it off. So I think I'm only going to show you the first couple of layers, and then I'll flick to the end of the actual soap making part of this video, because only half of this video is about the soap making itself, which seems a little sad, but that's the way this one's gone, because I didn't want to do a separate video just on the packaging because that felt a little bit excessive, and I didn't want to give you a video that would be 20 minutes of just mix a layer, pour a layer, which is, it's kind of boring. After you've done it once or twice, it's boring. But in the time I've taken to clean down and then mix up the second batch. The first batch is pretty much set. At least it's very strongly set, at least. So that makes it a little easier to do thicker layers like this. Later in the summer, I've got a Pride soap that I've used a completely different technique to mix. And I've managed to get 7 really even layers in using a milk soap without having any issues of acceleration or being too slow or whatever. So that's what I'll go to in the future for a layered soap. But just now, this is the process times 5. So just make sure to wipe down the mould in between layers so you don't have too much in the way of splash up the sides. Now the top decoration for these, I'm somewhat proud of and somewhat disappointed with. Now I had the idea to do daffodils on the top in soap dough, which was fine, but my sculpting skills have never been that great. I'm not so good on kind of fine and detailed and that kind of thing. So the leaves on these daffodils are quite chunky. So that's fine because they stand out nicely against the green of the top of the soap. But they were a little too large to kind of sit in properly and stay together. So I think virtually every flower I've put on both of these moulds had lost at least one petal, which is aggravating. And what I'm not going to show here is the leaves, because each one has also got a pair of leaves that stick up as well. So that was more fiddly and more nervous to try and do. And my original plan was to have 12 small bars out of each loaf. The original plan was to cut these flowers in half, so you'd have half a daffodil on each bar, but when it came to it, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't cut them in half. So I've ended up making some really chunky bars, which are nice, but I'm not getting as much out of them as I would like, because I just couldn't see a reason for cutting them in half, because they're just so much work to get them right. So there's no extra mica on top of these, so it's just the soap dough itself. You can see there the leaves as well, and the big chunky soap bars. Now packaging, I used to use a heat shrink plastic, but I've completely moved away from that. I haven't used heat shrink plastic in most of this year actually. So I've gone with a paper wrap, and I was using handmade paper strips to kind of decorate those. But my friend bought me a set of marbling inks. Now these are the Japanese marbling inks, Suminagashi, which I'm not using at all right. There's supposed to be a little paper dot thing floating in the bowl, and you drop the ink onto that, and then it stops it from dropping all the way through. But I tried that a number of times, I couldn't get it to work. So I've gone back to this style, which is kind of messy, and I'm losing a lot of ink in the process, and trying to get it to kind of move evenly by swizzling it with a chopstick is not really helping, it's just making a mess. So in future batches, in future marbling sessions, I'm actually using carrageenan moss in water to actually make a proper size, and I'm using alum on the paper, so it's all done right. So I use this stuff for a while, for a couple of batches, but it doesn't have, well, the set itself only came with 5 colours, so you're kind of stuck with the colours they're giving you to start with. They don't mix particularly well, and I wasn't getting a great kind of spread from them. So yeah, I won't be using this again. So I'm down to the packaging. So these soaps have sat for about 6 weeks. I just give them a quick trim just to take off kind of the edges and the corners and things. Every soap gets this kind of treatment. I think some soap makers use a soap plane or some quite kind of posh kit to bevel theirs, but peeler works. And because I'm no longer using plastic, I'm kind of double wrapping, and actually triple wrapping in this case, because I'm putting a little kind of tent of cardboard over the flowers to protect them because I don't want to knock off any of the flower. And then I use, this is baking parchment paper. I'm just using as a first wrap. And that's the only glue I'm using. I'm using a little bit of glue stick just to hold this layer on, particularly because it's springing back where the card is. So I don't normally use glue, so I normally just kind of fold it and let it sit as is, because I'm kind of reducing as much added stuff really to the packaging. So it's a little bit easier when they're actually more square bars, but because of the top they're not squared off. So here's my marble paper, and I made a number of this kind of yellow, red, green design. That one looks okay. It's about the only one that did, because they were the more vibrant colours I had. I had kind of a black and a blue, but they were really dark. And then when they came out on the paper, they weren't there at all. So it's one extreme or the other. So I actually think I made these strips a little too wide. I normally make them about 4 centimetres. These are 6, because I wanted to add the extra protection for the flower on top. So my outside wrap is some craft paper. So it's just brown packaging paper. And all of this is now done without any kind of glue or anything else to hold it together. So, and you can see to the top left, I've got a wax seal stove, I think they call it. So that's running with some little wax beads in. I have got a wax gun, which is like a glue gun but for wax, and that is a lot easier, a lot faster, but much more expensive actually if you work it out. So the green bit of folded card I'm putting in here is kind of a placeholder for a label. Previously I have just sealed them up and then tried to slide the label in behind, and it's just not worked. So I use a little placeholder there, put the seal on. And the one issue with this wax system is it takes a minute or two longer to melt the wax than it does to wrap the soap. So there's this kind of waiting for this thing to finish melting. And this is the first time I've actually used this stove, and it's smoking because I didn't know that you needed to wipe it off before putting it back on the flame, essentially. So I've since learnt that I wipe it off in between each one, so you don't end up with the soap dripping round and then causing that smoke. So seal goes on and put it to one side. And that's one other thing with this wax, it doesn't cool down as quickly as the stuff in the gun. So yeah, so that's just Daff soap, and that's ready to sell, ready to buy right now in the shops.